Thanks for coming, and good evening. I think we can just go ahead and get started. And if people come in a few minutes late, they will just come in during my introduction, and so they won't miss the critical part of the event, which is the conversation. So, hi, I'm Claire Schwartz. I'm the culture editor of Jewish Currents, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the final event in the Politics of Literary Practice, a series exploring the relationship between literary form and social meaning. Our conversation today is about translation, migration, and mobilization. In her letter of recommendation in the New York Times Magazine, the writer and translator Karina Del Valle-Shorsky writes, "Sometimes well-meaning people will say, I love the translations, but what about your own work? I don't really know what to say to that because the work feels like mine. You have to get inside the poem in order to articulate it, but the poem you get inside is someone else's. How is anything born but through a foreign body?" When I read Del Valle-Shorsky's formulation, I'm sent back to Emnor Besse Philip, who writes, "Each of us has allowed someone to breathe for us, our coming life dependent on an other breathing for us, a form of circular breathing. Could we perhaps describe this process as an example and expression of radical hospitality? Against the coercions of manufactured scarcity for the global majority, Del Valle-Shorsky's and Philip's writing makes me consider how the practice of translation vexes the idea of authorship as anything other than fundamentally relational, that to breathe is also a record of having been breathed for, that one's work has everything to do with another's syntax, that translation perhaps might be said to enact the radical hospitality Philip imagines. Still, where most people who are multilingual become so in contexts of coercion and necessity, even as near monolingual translators and imperial centers find audiences for their work, where many are born into tongues already occupied or into languages wielded as tools of domination, where the borders inscribed on bodies, lands, and language are not natural formations, so that even the construction of between or across might trace a severance as much as forge a connection. How can we think about the valences of various forms of movement? I'm thrilled to be here today with three translators, also writers themselves, Jenny Croft, Mona Karim, and John Keane, who think deeply about the politics of translation and whose translation and writing about translation expands my sense of the possibilities of the practice. Jennifer Croft won the 2020 William Saroyan International Prize for Writing for her illustrated memoir, Homesick, and the 2018 Man Booker International for her translation from Polish of Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk's Flights. She is also the author of Serpientes y Escaleras and the translator of, among other works, Federico Falca's A Perfect Cemetery and Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob. Mona Karim is a literary scholar and a translator between Arabic and English, whose translations include Ashraf Fayyad's Instructions Within, Ra'ad Abdul Qadir's Except for This Unseen Thread, and Octavia Butler's Kindred, and whose own works have been translated into 9 languages. Karim is also the author of 3 poetry collections and a recipient of a 2021 NEA literary grant, as well as fellowships and residencies with Princeton University, Poetry International, Arab American National Museum, and the Center for Humanities at Tufts University, where she's currently in residence. John Keane is the author, co-author, and translator of books, including the poetry collection, Punks, New and Selected Poems, and the fiction collection, Counter Narratives. Letters from a Seducer, his translation from Portuguese of Hilda Hilst's infamous novel, appeared in 2014. His awards include a 2018 Wyndham Campbell Prize in Fiction and a 2018 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. He's a distinguished professor of English and Africana Studies, which he currently chairs at Rutgers University, Newark. So I'm really very excited to be joined by Mona, John, and Jenny. And if time permits, we'll close out tonight's discussion with some questions from the audience. So please, as you're listening, if you have questions for the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A box. And if we're able, we'll get to those at the end. If you would like to turn on closed captioning, there's an option to do that at the bottom of your screen. And I see that some of you are already using the chat, but please do if things strike you, or if you want to underline something that someone said or offer affirmation or whatever. Yeah, please do. It's nice to feel like we're gathered. So I'll just start with an introductory question. Can you tell us something about what languages you move between, how you came to them, how you've stayed live to them, and how, to kind of borrow and transpose from Paul Gilroy, your roots in and the roots between the particular languages situate the key considerations of your practice? And I know it's a lot, so no pressure to be comprehensive, but just would love to hear what's kind of coming up for you in the space of those wonderings.
I would like to say gentlemen first.
Yeah.
You said gentlemen first, right? Okay, well, I wanted you guys to go first, but so let's see. So I was actually speaking to a class earlier today and talking a little bit about how I came to translation in multiple languages. And I was thinking about this a bit more in preparation for this conversation. And so I'll say, well, maybe focus on two components. So on the one hand, I've always been very interested in language itself. I'm the sort of person who tries to teach himself languages. I'm one of those people, right? And you know, I used to, as a child, I would go to the library, and among the many things I would pick up were books. You know, the teach. Remember, there used to be that teach yourself language series. So I had that experience. And so somewhere deep inside, there's been this desire to be able to, I guess, communicate across linguistic borders. And I grew up in a family. My parents were both native English speakers, so we code switched, right? As African Americans, it was a language spoken at home and a language that, I guess I was prepared to speak when I was in school, particularly in a predominantly white environments. So there was that kind of foundation. And then I went to a Catholic school beginning in 7th grade, where we had to take non-English languages. So I studied Latin and French, and then Greek, Latin and French in 7th grade, Greek in 9th grade, and German in 10th grade. So those were like some of the languages that were the options we had to study. I was thinking today, though, on the one hand, those the study of, on the one hand, modern European languages, and on the other hand, the classical languages like Latin and Greek, was a kind of colonizing experience in one way. In another way, though, it was a kind of a liberatory experience, because I realized at a certain point that it gave me access to other ways of looking at the world, right? So, of course, you have to decouple language from nation, et cetera. But it gave me a different kind of access, a different kind of way of thinking about and reading into language. And it's something that I've actually kind of continued to try to think about. When I wrote an essay a few years ago called Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, I wanted to think about, how knowing other languages and translating might produce a kind of counter-hegemonic practice, right? And that includes, it was kind of counter-hegemonic practice in terms of thinking about Blackness itself, right? Blackness particularly linked to the United States. So I would say that, that was kind of those were my sort of entry points into language. And then, of course, living in the United States, Spanish is a language that is, one of the most widely spoken here. So I thought I really should learn Spanish. I was very interested in Brazil and Portuguese. So I taught myself the rudiments of Portuguese, and then realized, with Portuguese, you have to speak to people or you won't be able to speak it, right? Because of you need to know how it's pronounced. So anyway, so I think all of those languages are kind of in my head. And then there are others. I was joking with someone just the other day that, I know just from, college, I knew someone who was studying Japanese, I knew someone who was studying Chinese, I knew someone who was studying Russian. So I have snippets of language in my head. and I feel like, you know, I primarily move between, in terms of as a translator, Portuguese and French, with some with increasingly more Spanish. Um, but I'm interested in languages in general, and the ways in which, you know, knowing languages and thinking about language, of course, can kind of transform our understanding of the world. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, I only speak Arabic and English, and I try to learn Spanish and French, but you know, I have this process of like learning something, leaving it, coming back later, like years later, you know, hoping to like resurrect it. You know, I think my I know we can say so much about like learning a new language, but I feel like the way I learned English, I was a monolingual Arabic speaker up until the age of 17. I went to college, majored in English. That's where I practiced English, like in the classroom, you know. I remember when I came to the States and how I would speak English, like people find it funny, you know, because it's like formal, it's like classroom. There is no soul to it, I guess, you know. But like learning English back home where it was just like a second language, you know, of course, the obvious choice to learn, you know, was not a charged experience, really. It was with a lot of like wonder and curiosity, and, you know, it was actually fun, you know, and no restrictions. But then when I came to the US and, you know, being an exile, and having to learn it in every way, like I had to learn it in every space, right? It wasn't enough to learn it as someone who was going to grad school. I had to learn it in the workplace and intimate spaces. You know, I had to learn how to cook in English. I need, you know, like how to describe the weather, right? Like it's the immigration services, like all kinds of Englishes, you know, that finally give you an English, right? Like, you know, a whole English to actually utilize and work with. And, you know, like I always say also, like that literature was part of my process of learning English. You know, like in high school, I didn't know English, but for example, I tried to read D.H. Lawrence by translating word by word, you know, like with a dictionary, like there wasn't Google Translate at the time, you know, so like just like word by word and like paragraph by paragraph, you know, that, so like that kind of intimate but laborious, you know, like relationship to English. So for many years, it felt to me like English as a second language and a language I translate into and from is, you know, is all about like labor and exhaustion, you know, and like, you know, sometimes I say like, don't make me speak English after 5 p.m. I'm tired, you know, I need to take a nap first or something, you know. It's like a different, you know, different faculties, different parts of your bodies that require this language. Also, I feel like sad that, you know, if I ever have to date someone who doesn't speak Arabic, I think this is sad, you know. And I can go on like with examples like these, but like I'm always, every day I have a different relationship to English, you know, like it's a different mood, you know, depends like what time of the day and which day you're catching me. I will give you a different answer to like how I think of English and learning it, but also, yeah, practicing it. Yeah, and I'll let Jennifer come in.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I grew up monolingual in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and like John, actually, I got very excited about going to the library and finding those old books and maybe some cassette tapes about teaching myself other languages. I think that I always felt a little bit alienated in Oklahoma from the people around me. I think both my sister and I did. And we were homeschooled. So we had the time to kind of investigate other cultures and other languages. I was really interested in writing and in language itself. And my sister started teaching herself Ukrainian, and I started teaching myself Russian because we wanted to be doing something similar enough that we could talk about it, but also different. And we don't need to talk about that too much more right now. But I then ended up finding translation via Russian. So at the University of Tulsa, which is where I went, there was this, one of the greatest poets of the Soviet Union, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, had come to Tulsa for reasons that I will never understand. I mean, he used to sell out stadiums of 50, 60,000 people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And he ended up being here, and he was also kind of lonely here. And I had the enormous privilege to get to work with him a little bit and to start translating poetry. I began with poetry and then knew that I wanted to pursue translation for a variety of reasons. I also knew that I wanted to translate contemporary women's writing kind of out of solidarity. And I went to the University of Iowa to do an MFA in translation, but when just a few weeks before classes started, there was like a coup in the Slavic department, and all of the Russian professors got angry about something and they left. And the only Slavic language that was available to study was Polish. So it was just a complete accident, and I ended up kind of immediately finding some women I wanted to translate, and ended up living in Poland for a few years. Via Polish, I ended up in Argentina because of Witold Gombrowicz, who's a Polish author who also accidentally, he went on a cruise in 1939 to South America, and something happened in Europe, and he ended up staying in Argentina for 23 years. So I went to do research on him, and something happened to me too. It was just within rather than external events, but I just kind of fell in love with it, and I began to translate from Spanish and also to write in Spanish. And to I co-founded a journal that was bilingual, and that really became like my home. I think that I finally found what I was searching for after failing to learn how to speak German and French and Italian and all these other things that I had kind of tried to pick up and hadn't really. So yeah, that's my story with those languages. I've also worked with Ukrainian and am working with Ukrainian a bit more now, but mostly Polish and Argentine Spanish specifically, because I have never lived anywhere else. So I don't feel comfortable taking those risks when I'm not sure that I fully understand tone and the nuances of voice in a Mexican novel, for instance.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, I'm struck by the way that, John and Jenny, you both talked about it kind of unlocking something in you to make contact with another language, another thought system, another way of being. And Mona, I think it sounds a little bit different for you in terms of the context of an exilee, and that you were living inside of another language in ways that you perhaps were and were not choosing. So I'm interested also in those inflections. And I'm wondering if we can maybe like get a little bit into the language itself. And I'm thinking about Jenny and your essay, The Order of Things, which you wrote about translating Olga Tokarczuk. You talk about the definition of syntax as the ways in which a particular word or part of speech can be arranged with other words or parts of speech. And you note that these are ethical and intersubjective aspects of the word. So I'm interested in how syntax describes, where it describes conventions of relation in a given linguistic system. I'm interested in if there are kind of grammatical disjunctures between the languages that you work in that feel especially present for you, which I guess is just another way of asking if there are things that kind of can't be brought across, and that space of kind of non-commensurability allows you to stand inside it and see what otherwise was sort of common sense or home to you differently.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting question with the languages that I work with are very different in the sense that the Polish language is in some ways identical with the Polish nation. There's nowhere else where it's spoken. And so it's very difficult to extricate Polish culture from Polish grammar or the Polish lexicon. And there are things that make me really uncomfortable about working with Polish that have to do with the politics of Poland, which, these are not new issues, but there are issues that have been coming to the fore quite a bit recently. And that is sometimes the case with Argentina too. It can't, there's no way of saying that about Spanish because there's so many Spanishes as there are so many Englishes and so many Arabics. And so when I try to think about, if I can actually find meaning in grammatical functions, it's a little bit tricky. And I think ultimately what I end up feeling is that more depends on the universe of a particular text, not even an author, like it's even more specific than that. So the Books of Jacob universe is a different one from the Flights universe. And that's the case for all of the writers that I've worked with. I like to maintain these relationships over time and translate multiple works by people. But yeah, I think, I've thought a lot about this question of untranslatability, which people love to talk about. And people in particular love to feel kind of mystified or in awe of other languages. Like, John, as I'm sure you probably always hear, like the word saudade in Portuguese is supposed to be this great untranslatable, but I always try to point out, like, look at all of these words in English that are also unique, like every language, everything is untranslatable to a certain extent, but also everything is translatable. It just depends on what you mean by translation. Like there is no exact equivalent of anything anywhere. But in prose in particular, you have so many opportunities to kind of compensate and reformulate and rework. And I think that that element of dynamism is what really draws me to translation, like the fact that everything is always in flux and it's this relationship that's always growing and changing, and that's exciting.
Yeah, I don't know if anything is coming up for you, Don or Mona, but.
Well, I guess for me, what's interesting to sort of think about, I mean, I love what Jenny is saying about, Polish being tied primarily to, a nation. And when I was saying earlier about, decoupling language and nation, I mean, clearly there are all kinds of links, but it's interesting, for example, Portuguese is a global language, Spanish is a global language, English is a global language. I think we always, we forget, as Jenny's saying, that, in English itself, there are many things that are really sort of untranslatable, particularly depending on where where a text is emerging or who's speaking, what we're speaking about, and so that made me think of, Mona's comments about learning Englishes, right? Having to develop a kind of English to live or Englishes to live, right? Depending upon the situation. I mean, we often don't think, I mean, like, you need to cook, to go to the doctor. I mean, anything, you need to be able to communicate. And so just thinking about the complexities of language and how we negotiate it without thinking often in our our source language, but one of the things that translation makes so visible is how we have to have, makes that visible, makes those seams visible, how that negotiation works, right? Because even when sometimes you think you've gotten something, you might not really have gotten it, or you might not have captured something. I mean, this just brings to mind, I was talking earlier when I said with a class, and the professor teaching the class pointed to a poem that I translated, a snippet of a poem I translated by the Afro-Cuban writer, Nancy Morejon. And she uses the word simples, and I translate simples as natural. She's talking about a natural Black woman, a new natural Black woman, right? And he said, to discuss it with the class, he was saying, simple in English, the two simple in English and Spanish, simplest are cognates, right? And one would think, you could just easily go with the English, but simple in English often has such a negative connotation. And so what I was saying to him was, I mean, part of what I was trying to argue in the essay, translating poetry, translating Blackness, was that, you really have to think about, like kind of the constellation of context, right? These kind of intersectionality being part of it, right? Of where the work that you're translating is coming from, and sort of situate yourself in it. And what I was trying to suggest to him was that my use of the word natural for simplest felt to me relevant on many levels, but particularly on a cultural level. One of the things that I thought that Nazi Maricon was trying to convey was that the women that she was describing, these new natural Black women, that there was a larger and richer context within which to think about that term simplest, right? That the adjective simplest. So just going to a dictionary would basically not give you what you needed, right? And so that, I guess, it just makes me think about just how it brings me often as a writer in English back to what words mean and how they function in English. Translation for me often, in other languages often opens up all kinds of doors and keys and gets me thinking. And I just want to also add that I feel like, Jenny mentioned translating prose. I translate poetry. I've translated prose, a lot of prose, but I often translate poetry. And I think poetry poses particular challenges when it comes to translation, because I feel like, often you reach, points of impossibility, and it's like, how can I go on, right? This is untranslatable, and yet we still translate poetry. So
I don't know. I feel inspired to share some examples also, because I feel like we're talking about syntax, but also, like untranslatability. We're talking about genre also, and the way they're, like, let's say, formulated in each language. I want to say, for example, like I always notice whenever I read an English translation, especially an American translation of an Arabic novel, it's always, I like to describe it, butchered. It's butchered down to like short sentences, and it's always like, you can say domesticated, but I like to think of it as like tamed and organized. It's very organized. So there's like this stylistic that is so powerful in Arabic, that if you are someone who goes back to read the Arabian Nights, for example, or any of the fables, really, like from the Arabic tradition, you will see these run-on sentences, that like come together, like that are interconnected like chains in a way, and inherently have something to do against linear storytelling, storytelling that climaxes and comes down, like the way we know it through, say, American fiction, right? So there's so much into the syntax of Arabic fiction that goes erased and is like suppressed in English translation. And why? Because there's this idea, this priority of like the plot, right? Like we need to tell the story, and therefore, like, how do we make this digestible, And there's this like patronizing approach to the reader, that the reader would not be able to like handle this, right? And then you go and like read someone like Laszlo Krasznahoraki, like where with all these like block, paragraphs, and like like the translators fight for this kind to keep this style, and then of course he is praised and like this is exceptional, and and so on. Like there's these sometimes translators take risks and like stand up for like the power that this language comes, and like how this language also creates an aesthetic intervention in your target language. If your target language is organized in a different way, has a certain logic that is, a lot of the times is a capitalist logic also, let's say, so that is something that struck me about the syntax. I wanted to say something about translatability, but I forgot it. So I'll let Claire take us on.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of it, feel free to, re-enter. I am actually really interested if we could stay with the question of genre for a minute. Jenny, I thought it was really interesting that you said so that you kind of work on the unit of the text, and that the unit of the individual text sort of guides some of the ways that you negotiate the choices between the languages. I feel like this idea of text, a text kind of teaching you how to read it, is something that people often talk about in terms of poetry. And so I'm wondering if your relationship, I know John and Mona, you work between poetry and prose. Jenny, I know that you've worked across different kinds of prose. I'm not sure if you've worked with poetry as well. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to genre and translation. You, I think, used the word, the possibilities of compensation, or sort of what the kind of circumference that you feel comfortable sort of moving in, if that has a relationship to genre, or sort of the ways that genre has a relationship to some of the choices that you make and the kind of syntactical navigations that you make between the languages.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I would also love to just respond to what Mona said, which is which touches on some of my favorite subjects. So I'm teaching in an MFA program right now, and it's so difficult to get my students to think outside of the kind of automatic inclinations of US taste, literary taste. I think taste is such an interesting question in literature, and it's really difficult to kind of break them out of this need for efficiency, for instance, which is such an American thing. Like you have to prioritize plot, and you have to be as efficient as possible. So as Mona said, like those sentences should be as short as humanly possible in order for everything to be perfectly clear and for there to be this kind of inevitable momentum. Otherwise, the reader can't possibly understand it, which is, as you said, so patronizing. And I often think of the case, so speaking of genre, of Olga Tokarczuk's Flights, which I tried to sell in the English speaking world for 10 years. And every single editor I spoke to, whether in the US or in the UK, told me in no uncertain terms that this was just, it was too slow, which is what I kind of always get with every translated manuscript I approach anyone with. And it was also just too strange. It was too disorganized. You know, this thing that Olga calls a constellation novel, where it's, you know, it's a novel, but it's also all kinds of different genres. So it's essays, and it's short stories, and it's memoir, and you know, on and on and on. And she kind of throws these up into the sky, and she invites the reader to participate in the construction of a narrative if they want, or you can just read it and enjoy it as these independent pieces. And in the end, you know, the book was a bestseller, like after the 10 years of my begging and pleading with people to read it and to consider it for publication. And people are not as stupid as publishing houses seem to believe they are. I mean, people are up for adventures in so many cases. And I think I do try to kind of subtly intervene. I'm not, yeah, I feel like the subtlety of my interventions in English language grammar, or in just like the traditions of English language storytelling, has to do with my desire to also, you know, first of all, like I'm in a relationship with these authors and I want to help them reach new readers. So I don't want to do so much that it does become too overwhelming for people in the US to actually pick up the book. And I also want them to enjoy the work, while they're also maybe like being called upon to rethink everything they know about how literature is supposed to function. So I guess like I am becoming less and less poetic with age, for whatever reasons. Maybe I'm just delegating that to my husband, who's a poet, but I am really mostly drawn to like hybrid genre work, which is also my own writing fits into that. So like something between fiction and nonfiction, something incorporating photography, something that defies convention in whatever way. And yeah, as I'm translating, I try to be more beholden to sort of the spirit of the text than to the individual lines. And that's where that compensation that I mentioned comes in. I don't know that compensation is the right word, but just, you know, trying to achieve something that the author achieved. If I can't get it in one place, then I can get it in another, or in a slightly different way. That was my idea.
Well, it's interesting. That makes me think of well, thinking about syntax. It sort of reminds me of years ago. Just to give you two examples of two works, I translated a collection of short pieces. They were uh, all prose, but very poetic in an interesting way. Some more non-fictional, some more fictional, by the Brazilian writer Jean Willis, who was a star on Big Brother Brazil. That's how I think he became famous. He was a journalist first. He then became a star on Big Brother Brazil, and then became a politician. And he actually living here. He had to actually leave for his own personal safety after Bolsonaro was elected. But one of the things that I found so fascinating about this collection of short pieces of Fleitas, which won awards, at least one award, maybe several, when it appeared initially, was that that the syntax of the prose itself, right, really were embodying the particular neighborhood in Bahia, the sort of realm and neighborhood of Aflitos in Bahia, Brazil, that he was writing about, and it was extremely condensed. It did not have, for obvious reasons, a lot of the sort of things we expect in sort of American conventional American short storytelling. And I would show these pieces to people, and they would want to, kind of add ands and thes, and basically plump it out, right, and make it. I mean, so brevity was, of course, the sort of efficiency that Jenny's talking about is, a narrative efficiency and almost a stylistic efficiency that we usually expect in American English, right, was there, but it was not what it didn't look like American English, conventional American short storytelling. And there was so much pushback, and I thought, well, maybe it's my translations, But then, every so often someone would see it and say, "Oh, no, I think you really kind of capture what Jean Willis is trying to do." So I mentioned that. Another example of this, where there was a lot of pushback, in part because it just did not look like conventional American prose, was in the late '90s. I found I was traveling in France, and I found a novel, Je mange neuf, which was, again, sort of somewhere between, sort of like autofiction, somewhere between nonfiction and fiction, by the Swiss artist and writer Nicolas Page. And it's almost like strobe-like, it's very condensed, but very sort of strobe-like prose, right? So you get, I do this, I do this, I do this. And to me, I found it absolutely fascinating. It's almost kind of mesmerizing. And again, when I tried to get people to publish even snippets of it, they're like, well, what is this? Who is this? It doesn't look like what we expect. So, I mean, one of the things that it got me thinking about is that, I do, as Jenny's saying, we do sort of internalize a lot of these expectations, which are the expectations of a certain kind of set of conventions about what American literature is supposed to look like, contemporary American literature is supposed to look like. And I mean, I think clearly they're just endless counterexamples, but it's a challenge because, of course, we're dealing with a capitalist industry, right, that has certain kinds of expectations. And one of the things I find so fascinating is, as Jenny's saying, sometimes if you can get some of this work published, I mean, it actually does well. People are very interested in it. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of mention that to think about, to sort of talk about both syntax and this question of like the sort of readerly expectations when it comes to translated work. And that's prose, but I think the same is true of poetry.
So if you don't have a question, I can just pick off of this, because I prefer to translate poetry. I wish I would never translate like fiction, like I like I'm anti-novel. I would like the novel to disappear one day. No, but I'm just being extremist in the Borgesian prophecy kind of thing, but yeah, like I do translate poetry mainly, and when I translated Kindred into Arabic, there was a story behind it, really. Like, I loved the novel, and I especially loved it because it was different from all her other novels, actually. It sat with me for a while, and I told like a publisher, and 2 years later he's like, oh, I got the translation right. So like I felt like, oh, now I have to do it. But like I mostly like translated poetry like in both directions. And the way I went about it was that, oh, I like this poem, I'm gonna translate it. Like there wasn't much thought into it. And it was also selfish because I am a poet, so I'm always like, I'm jealous you wrote this great poem, so I'm gonna like steal it in this like legal way, right? Like, and like put my name next to you. But I will say something that like the beautiful thing about being writer and translator at the same time is that you are, on one side, you are very generous, and while translating, you fight for the text, like, and not to undermine like, people who only translate, of course not, but I just mean that there is something that has to do with the process, of like relating to that process. So you work with generosity, but at the same time, you are being selfish in the sense that you're learning, it's like your learning process of like, I'm not a fiction writer, but I can live the fiction writing experience through Butler, right? Like, in this world building, and like the affect, and like how do you write prose, how do you write dialogue. For a long time I really did not appreciate dialogue in fiction, but when I translated Kindred, I was like, wow, like the dialogue is a whole thing, it's a whole layer, and it's like so masterful, and like like dense, and also like when translating it into Arabic, I ran into issues such as, for example, in Arabic we don't do like a line and then he said, she said, like it's actually, you would put like, I don't know, like just a new line, and people understand somehow that this is this character, that character, and so I was like I was translating the way like it appears to me in English, and the editor was like, we don't have this in Arabic, right? Like we don't have she said, he said, so I was like, well, now we do, like this is this is the way that translation like beautifully like sneaks in aesthetics, and really that's like the amazing like radical tradition of like Arabic literary translation, especially modern, is that it's always functioned with this logic that we are cannibalizing things, we're making them ours, like we are like they are at the service of Arabic literature, so like when I translated Kindred, I didn't think like Butler would like care about this, for example, maybe she would have cared, but I'm saying like I didn't do it like for the author, or like as a gesture. It was more of like, what does this do to the Arabic reader, and especially because we have so much interest in like in history, in race, all of these like issues that are now becoming big in the contemporary novel, but we don't have novels that do that masterfully, like how do you do this? How do you break the idea of like progress, which is like such a colonial idea, like there is no progress, right? Like how do you break linear history and so on, so the beautiful thing is this intimacy of being a translator. You get to witness all of this, you witness the magic, and you hope that it somehow touches others in a way.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I think I'm gonna bring in a question from the chat because it resonates with what you were saying, Mona. It's actually addressed to Jenny, but I think actually all of you have spoken to things that resonate with this. So Robert Kaufman asks, as someone constantly amazed when hearing Argentino speak Spanish, I'm wondering how you engage the moment sometimes within the same sentence, where Italian, German, Polish, Russian, Hungarian, Yiddish, and more seem to have melded with Spanish and yet keep bursting out in their micro particularities. How has working with Argentine texts affected how you hear and read Spanish from elsewhere, but also how you hear other languages that you've overheard within Argentine Spanish? And I think, Jenny, you can answer that, but I think it also speaks to, John, what you sort of opened with, thinking about kind of code switching, moving between different Englishes. Mona also talked about moving between different Englishes, but also the way even what we talk about as a language doesn't describe a sort of hermetically sealed system, but is always filled with other kinds of seams. So I don't know, Jenny, if you want to start us off and maybe we can build up.
Sure. I can just say briefly, it's a question that I faced a lot when translating the books of Jacob too, where Olga this is kind of a political project of not nation building, but nation rebuilding. So Olga writes this, 912-page novel in which, the 18th century kind of melting pot of Poland is brought back to life. So there are people who are speaking Yiddish and people who are speaking Hebrew, people who are speaking Russian and Ukrainian and Turkish and Ladino and on and on and on. And it's an important part of the project to kind of throw those languages in there. And, in those cases, they're discrete lines of text. So it's not a situation in which languages have melded, as has been the case in Argentine Spanish. But that's the case also in English. Like if we go back far enough, most languages have some component of this, and English is, of course, like Romance language and Germanic language, and it also has, quite a bit of Yiddish and other elements. So I think actually it's a natural fit for Argentine Spanish, and I don't worry about it too much. And I, as I was translating the books of Jacob, I also tended to just kind of like bring those over as they were, without imposing, without over clarifying or over explaining or translating something that wasn't translated in the original. The tricky part comes when I run across, which happens a lot in contemporary Argentine writing, when I run across something that is in English within the Argentine text. So how do you translate English into English? I hate that. It's one of my greatest pet peeves of translation. I don't want any English in the original text. I don't know what to do with it. But on to John and Mona.
Well, I'll just say quickly, sort of related to this, when I was translating Ilya's letters from a seducer, Cartas en Seductor, and I actually wrote a little essay about this. One of the challenges was that Ilse uses pretty much every register of Portuguese. So, and I believe her mother was from Portugal, and she was known for reading aloud at times in a European Portuguese accent, which of course, if you're Brazilian, you would hear immediately. But she was also very interested in like all the traditions of Lusophone literature, all of the registers, like popular registers in Brazilian Portuguese, etc. And so you get all of this in this fascinating hybrid text that is really kind of an anti-novel. It pushes repeatedly against all the conventions, even of the Brazilian novels of her day. It really is a kind of anti-novelistic text. But at the level of language, it was an incredible challenge, because there were certain things where, there was just, I was like, what do I do? And I would talk to one of the people involved in publishing the book, who was Brazilian. I spoke to a poet friend of mine. I would ask him questions, and he was like, I have no idea what Ilde's just saying. Don't you understand? Even Brazilians don't know at times. So I had to kind of reverse engineer. One example I always give was she uses this term. One of the terms she uses is kermesse, which we have in English, like a kermesse, like a kind of country fair, which is not at all what she's talking about. But that's part of what she's talking about. But it also has this completely different slang meaning, which means it's like a high class orgy, right? And so I was like, wait a minute, how do you render this? Because of course, if Brazilian is your, if you're part, Brazilian Portuguese is your first language, and you know this term, right? You're going to get both of those very different things at the same time. But in English, there's no way to kind of fuse them together. So there were a lot of challenges like that that I found, and as I said, I had to to really kind of do a lot of reverse engineering at various moments, sort of figure out what she was what she was drawing upon. Because if I had assumed, okay, this is an author who spent most of her life, primarily in Sao Paulo, and all the terms would be, Paulistano terms, I would have been missing the vast majority of what she was talking about. Because the other thing too is she's referencing, this like on every page a different author, from around the globe, including many in English, because she was very interested in English language literature and European literature in general, and Brazilian literature. So it's all there, as well as I said, everyday speech. So the question is, challenge was, how do you bring all of this together so that it's coherent and so that it works as as a functioning text.
I just wanted to share a quick example that fits in these examples. Like one of my favorite translations ever, really, is an Egyptian translation of Ulysses, and it was the second translation, Arabic translation of Ulysses. There's 3 translations. The first one was not completed. The man died, Ulysses killed him, and the second one, is by Dr. Taha, Mahmoud Taha. He was I forgot what his specialty was, but something in Irish drama, actually. But like parallel to that, he just like got infected with Ulysses and with Joyce, and he spent like over 10 years, like working on it. And then when it came out, it was people were really unfair to him. And by people, I really mean writers. Writers were like, "Oh, I want like authentic, Ulysses. Like, don't, how dare you get experimental, And I'm mentioning names like Naguib Mahfouz himself. He was like, I would never read this. Like, his English was good, so he just read the English. So it was really unfair to him. So he went and like worked on that translation another 5 years and created a parallel like dictionary, of all the words that he made up to like mimic the words like that Joyce made up, like all this effort, this guy is like fantastic, and the way he dealt with all the different languages that exist in Ulysses, and also like the folklore, like the songs, all of that, is that he was like, I have Egypt, Egypt is huge. There's all these like literatures, cultures, like, villages, sea life, city life, all of that. So he has this massive, ocean, let's say, to take from. So he really like just went for a domesticated, version of Ulysses that was, I believe, it's like visionary, revolutionary, exceptional. And so many of us in Arabic translation don't dare to do this because they, like the editors and the publishers like would never let us, they're like, I can't sell this, I'm not gonna I don't want to publish a translation that only like writers, like weird writers and academics will read, make this accessible. And they might even call you elitist, for like going so far with the experimentation and, trying to, he really tried to address like the aesthetic of Ulysses, right? Like, this is how Ulysses is, and you guys want to read him, so I'm giving you one solution, right? So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, we are almost at time. I'll just ask one more question. I could talk to you all forever, but I know that probably wouldn't be enjoyable for you. But anyway, so I'm really interested about the question of the way that the sort of, really, just to put it bluntly, like questions of what can be sold kind of keep coming up. And I think there's a way that I'm thinking of that I recently heard Salma Sharif tell David Naiman on the podcast Between the Covers, and she was talking about she sort of framed it around a question of an ethical failure in the classroom. And she talked about how after Trump had bombed Afghanistan, she instructed her students to go to the library and to, gather all of the books by Afghan poets that they could find. And they came back with 4 books. And so they sort of talked about both the dearth of literature that had been translated, but also, the failure of the lesson itself, that it was that the necessity for engaging Afghan literature only came in the moment of this, spectacular military violence. And I think this is really it's something we're seeing around Ukraine right now. It's something that we saw around Palestine in the summer. This is something that kind of comes up where US, I'm speaking in particular about the US because that's just the context that I know best, but where, imperial military action provides this sort of appetite for translated literature in this very narrow window. And I'm wondering if that's something that as translators working in the US, you navigate in any way, or if you feel like there's a relationship there that feels alive to you.
Well, being like, I guess like being someone who is translating from my native language, I'm like, this sleeps my, this steals my sleep, as they say, like this question of like, how problematic translation is and violent and charged, and like really, I feel like we are like, I'm someone who is definitely a big fan of literary translation. I grew up reading translated literature, in Arabic, so, but at the same time, being in the US, I had to stop and ask myself this question of like, yeah, like, I need to be careful with translation and like, like the lore of it, and what it promises and so on, because especially if you are, and I love that you brought the classroom experience there, you see like, like a very particular experience. Like, is it a creative writing classroom? Is it Arab studies? Is it, like all of that really decides so much. And, I get to see like how different classes, how different, like sometimes you work with like very raw expectations and like stereotypical understandings of the Arab world. And like, you're like, I don't even have a common ground to like read a novel with you, and it's devastating, it's overwhelming. And sometimes you ask yourself the question of like, why am I doing this, and like, really, what is my goal, like, and feel like at loss of this. But I will say something is that like what is beautiful is for us, like, let's say for Arabs in diaspora at large, and like writers, like translators and so on, like when we sit among each other, I love that there is now this knowledge, like the Iraqis tell the Syrians, listen, they're going to care for you 2 years. You're going to be an old story, don't rely on it, like, and like do your thing. So like, there is always like this knowledge accumulating, this communal knowledge of like how empire uses you, disposes you, it's like, there's never going to be like a real commitment to your literature and expression, because this is the status of culture and hegemony, like you will always barely be a margin, and like be an occasional read in that sense.
I have nothing to add. That was beautifully stated, Mona. I agree.
I don't know, Jenny, if you want to add anything, or we can leave it with.
No, I think that's beautifully stated. I mean, I've had these experiences with, like after 10 years, I finally got a publisher for Olga Tokarczuk, but it was only because of the timing. It was Brexit and the Polish people in the UK were being bullied. And so the editor just like chose any random thing that he happened to have in his computer. I had sent him, a sample of flights, and in the last like 6 weeks, my husband and I have gotten inundated with requests for translations of Ukrainian authors after many, 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 many years of, people only wanting retranslations of Tolstoy. It's very, very frustrating, and I can't really like add more than what Mona already said.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to everyone who virtually joined us for this conversation, and I'm wishing you all a really good night. And
Thank you so much, Claire.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.